Hello and welcome to another special episode of Not the Top 20. Regular listeners, it isn't very often that you stick in your AirPods or your earphones to listen to a podcast on our feed, and it's not Ali giving the intro. It's even rarer that Ali's voice doesn't even exist, but this is one of those shows that I'm hosting, George Elek. I'm delighted to be joined by Daniel Storey as we catch up after a couple of weeks. Daniel's still doing the 92. You can catch up with all his progress over at iNews and iSport. Daniel, since you last spoke to Ali a couple of weeks ago, how's the progress getting on? How many more grounds have you ticked off?
So I think we are... Well, I've done 14 games and I think we've got 11 pieces out at the moment. Maybe 12 by the time listeners hear this. But yeah, it's going. That's 15% of it done, I suppose. Do you feel like you're in the kind of footballer mentality now where like you get to international break and you're like, brilliant, I can relax for kind of 10 days now, this is the rest that I need? We did have a little bit of that. Chesterfield Grimsby. I think the way that these international breaks are going to go is that although Sky are with a TV deal are very much, they've got their Thursday nights and Monday night games occasionally, those international breaks are still going to be quite quiet with postponements obviously. So yes, is a little bit of a downtime, but it does just make me think, well, if I'm having to do average 5 every 2 weeks over the season, I can't actually afford quiet weeks, even though I desperately want them. That's the sort of clanging irony of all this.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I'm amazed. There are, tonight, we're recording this on Tuesday. I'm surprised that you didn't choose Wrexham against Salford in the EFL Trophy North Group B as your chance to go to Wrexham. I think that makes total sense. I think anyone is going to be one of the smallest crowds we'll see at Wrexham all season. Looking, before we get into what we're going to talk about this time around, where you've done a few manager interviews over the course of the series so far, and a player interview as well with Rhian Brewster, and we're going to kind of talk through some of the themes around those in your conversations with those guys. But before we do, just in terms of what people can look forward to coming up in the series, news came out this morning that this won't be the only podcast that you'll be talking about your journey on. There will be one official that will be coming out.
Yeah, we started it a couple of weeks ago. The aim is to do an episode per feature, effectively. So if it's an interview with Danny Rohl, for example, we will have, weave in some of the audio, talk about Sheffield Wednesday. I think probably more of a kind of casual audience than necessarily a sort of deep dive, granular inspection of Sheffield Wednesday. I think it's more about taking readers on the journey, readers of the eye on the journey. But yeah, we're going to be doing 2 a week for 26 weeks, which kind of takes us through to the end of the season. So yes, I am. My fingertips are burning from lots of typing, and my throat will be sore from lots of talking. So the more, the better.
I'm afraid you're going to have to talk quite a lot for the next for the duration of this episode as well. And what have you got? I've seen your schedule, and as someone who would absolutely dream to be commissioned to go to every single ground in the country over the course of a season, this weekend in particular, albeit Friday, one of the games at AFC Wimbledon is a game that I don't know if you're allowed to say you want to go to because of the connotations and because it is so controversial, but you do have a pretty special weekend coming up in terms of the fixtures you're going to. Yeah,
I've got AFC versus MK Dons on Saturday. That's a 12:30 kickoff, which is quite nice. I just want to go along, and having spoken to AFC and people there, I'm going to go and sit with them, and quite like to do a piece that, the slight irony of it is that we're going to do it on MK Dons Day, or the home derby day, but I think they'd like to make the point that they are more than what they're not. The AFC is a club in its own right now. It was obviously a protest club and a Phoenix club as they see it to start with, but it's more than that now, and it's come on, and especially since the move to the new stadium, etc. So it's the first time I'll have been there, which is to the Cherry Reds, so I'm looking forward to that. And then my first Premier League game on the Sunday, which is Tottenham Arsenal, so sort of derby day weekend.
Only Tottenham Arsenal.
Arsenal. And I think with that we're going to do a, not necessarily relevant to the NTT 20 audience, but just a kind of piece on the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, whether that quite feels like home yet. I couldn't quite believe it was 7 years since they'd left White Hart Lane, which seems to have flown by. So just a kind of deep discussion kind of fan sentiment about the new stadium. So yeah, and then Birmingham, Wrexham on Monday evening, which already feels like title battle for. I mean, I guess they both go up from League One this season, don't they? But it does feel very much like setting stall out territory.
It is. I think that game, it's annoying because Ali and I are so keen not to overhype, give Wrexham more coverage than other teams in League One and League Two last season. We're so keen not to give more coverage to Birmingham this season because they are a giant, and the spending levels, I guess, that we're seeing from them is like nothing we've seen before in League One. But there's no getting away from the fact that Wrexham's story and their back-to-back promotions, the way they've started this season, means they are one of the most interesting teams in the country right now, or in the leagues right now. And the same with Birmingham, where spending 15 million plus 5 on a player at League One level is just in itself a fascinating topic and something I can't wait to see unfold. So I am very jealous you're going to that on Monday. You'll have to do like a scout report on Wilson Audibert at the bottom of your piece for Spurs, just to give it a slight EFL twinge if you want to get invited back on the show.
That's fair. My only worry about Monday night is that, having been to Bolton 0, Wrexham 0, I've got a horrible feeling that it might fit that same pattern of both teams not hugely disappointed with a draw, so maybe we take it and move on. But
yeah.
Hopefully I'm completely wrong.
Yeah, although I think for Birmingham, they will want to, at some point soon, they'll want to put out a bit of a statement. Like, obviously, the results have been good, but the level of dominance, I would say, hasn't been necessarily what you'd expect from a team whose financial clout is so far clear. But we could talk about this stuff all day. Let's get into the stuff that we're going to talk about here, and these are the interviews that you put out already. So we've seen... you've spoken to Danny Rohl, to Rob Edwards, to Tom Cleverley, and as I say, we're recording this on Tuesday. I think, as you said, tomorrow, so Wednesday, the 11th of September, an interview with Danny Cowley will be going live. As we say, you can find this over at iNews and under the Sport tab, where you can find all of Daniel's stuff. Before we get into this, I thought it was really interesting looking at the 4 managers he's spoken to, where firstly you've got 3 Championship managers to start with, and then a dip down into League Two with Danny Cowley, who got a Championship job not that long ago at Huddersfield. But most importantly, the range of profiles of these guys, where Danny Cowley was a teacher who wasn't a professional footballer, who came through the non-league coaching ranks. You've got Danny Rohl, who was a player at a young age in the German amateur leagues, who then basically wedded himself to Ralf Hasenhüttl and came through the coaching system with him at Leipzig and Southampton. You've got Tom Cleverley, who came through at Manchester United, who played for England and played at Old Trafford and played under Sir Alex and was a Premier League footballer for a long time. And then Rob Edwards, who was kind of a good but not great footballer who retired relatively early and then has cut his teeth with loads of different coaching jobs. Like, it is almost, you couldn't have chosen 4 more perfect different profiles that fit quite neatly into the categories of what managers are these days. Yeah,
I think that's true, and I would also happily accept that wasn't entirely deliberate. I think that's just the way it goes now, that there is such a vast range, even deeper down the divisions than there ever used to be. There seems to be greater kind of fluency between the divisions, whether it's for geographical reasons or family reasons or whatever, but managers being prepared to drop down a little bit and try and take clubs up. There seems to be more of that, I think. The ultimate example I can think of that is Paul Cook going back to a Chesterfield and thinking, well, this kind of fits me, so I know what I'm doing here, this is what I'll do. And then you've got this young crop of managers who, I think 5 or 6 years ago, we were still slightly stuck in that, what I'd call that sort of Keys and Gray cliche of, I'm not going to get a chance at the Premier League, so what's the point? That Dean Windass tweet, like doing our badges, all that stuff, which I think was probably slightly overblown, but definitely existed to a point. And now, I said it somewhere else, and it sounds like a really cliched sort of line, but almost like the firefighters have become the fire starters. So whereas the sort of, the parody of the English manager is this sort of like 4-4-2 direct, we'll defend our box and I'll keep a team up and I'll never have a relegation on my CV. Now it's the complete opposite. It's this like progressive, I want to like counter pressing and courage with the ball and playing out from the back, and it's everything that we didn't see before. And it's really exciting to see, mainly because it doesn't always work, and it can't always work if everybody's trying to do it. So, yeah, it's been a really nice way to start the project with these four, because as you say, they are all different, and yet weirdly, you talk to Danny Cowley and you talk to Danny Rohl, and they sometimes say the same things about how they want to play the game, which I just don't think you'd have got at the bottom of League Two or mid-table League Two to Championship 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And you say that, and all I'm thinking about now is the reaction when Steve Bruce was appointed manager at Blackpool last week, where 10, 15 years ago, that would have felt like a very obvious appointment. A team who want to get out of League One, appoint a manager who's done it before but has struggled at the Championship. It's perfect. Whereas now it happens, everyone's like, what the hell's going on? He's 62. Yeah. And me included are thinking, why are they doing this? Why are they making this decision? I've been lucky enough to work a bit with Danny Cowley. I really like him. He's someone whose company I love spending time in. How did you find him? He's he said himself in the piece, I live with my life in positives. I see a lot of people who see the worst in everyone, and it seems such a miserable way to live. And 5 minutes in his company will show you that he is someone who just exudes positivity. Yeah,
that's not bluster, is it? That is very much wearing his heart on his sleeve. He is a relentlessly positive man. I think he's really happy to be back in Essex as well. Obviously the success with Concord and then Braintree, and then Lincoln, and I think he would never say this because it sounds negative, but I think we have to accept that the Danny Cowley of 2019-20, or when he got that job at Huddersfield, and it felt like that star was very much in ascendance. And he says, I've managed, I think, in 9 of the top 10 leagues in English football, and I still want to get back to the Premier League. For that to happen, he does need to take on another of those projects, a Lincoln, if you like. Take a team up 1 or 2 divisions. That's going to be very hard at Colchester, but I think it's probably the right fit for him. He's back, he's near his mum and dad. He hasn't lived with near his mum and dad for years. Obviously, he's got Nicky with him, so there's a big family element of that from where they came from. And I think he sees a club with potential, albeit it's got potential because it hasn't done very well over the last 15, 16, 17 years. They're in the Championship, upper end Championship in 2007, and pretty much there's not been. You look at all these clubs, and loads of them have had financial disasters, or they've had emergencies, or everybody's fallen out with each other. It's not really happened with Colchester. They just sort of got a little bit worse over time and not been able to arrest that. So I think he sees himself as this kind of reconnector of all disparate parts of the club, which is pretty much what he did at Lincoln. And he had lots of excellent players, and he developed some of those players, but he also just got the fans completely behind him. And talking to the fans outside the game at Colchester, they are incredibly proud that they've got someone they see as an upper League One, at worst, manager, managing the club that finished 90th in the FL last year.
Yeah, I always think it's interesting with Danny because his, the Lincoln team that was made famous initially through their exploits in the Cup, with Matt Reed, a big, proper non-lead looking striker playing up top. I think he got a reputation for playing a certain way, and when he got the move to Huddersfield, it felt like he was very keen to show that he was playing that way because of the tools he was given, rather than that necessarily being the way that he wanted to play. I remember going to see Huddersfield at Fulham, and they had Emil Smith-Rowe playing on loan with them, and he was brilliant on the day, obviously now a Fulham player. And that feels to me, and it's something that he mentions in the piece, like working with young technical players and helping them believe in themselves is a key part of the way that he sees his strengths as a head coach.
Yeah, I mean, he when we talk about his relentless positivity, I think the aim, I don't think this is just a crux of man management. I think it comes naturally to him, but the aim is that confidence becomes infectious. What he walked into at Colchester, he said, is a squad that actually wasn't as fractured or as disillusioned as it might have been, given that I think they'd lost 10 in 11 and were potentially heading out the Football League. He steadied that ship by adding some grit, and now he does want to make, he does want to kind of spread that positivity. He talks about there's a thing with Danny where if anyone else said it, it would, and if it sounded inauthentic, it would just sound like management speak. But he has a way of talking that means you do kind of buy into it. And I suspect players are the same. And he sort of says, confidence comes with competence. And I think that's basically his mantra at Colchester. They've played pretty badly for a long time, 3 or 4 years, and everybody needs a new mood. And I can't think of many managers, given his success in Essex previously, many better fits for that job. I'm not sure if they'll be top half this season. I think it's probably a pretty long-term project, not least because they've obviously lost some players over the summer again to Stockport and Peterborough and Port Vale, and you do sort of get a sense that club is having to reinvent the wheel every summer with the squad. He's added a fair amount of experience, but it will be with all of these pieces I'm doing in early season, I'm then fascinated to see how it then transpires across the rest of the season, because you find yourself backing Danny, don't you? You find yourself just wishing him well by default, because he says he's managed 900 games now. He's really put in the hard yards, even though a lot of those were in non-league. He's still only 45 years old, and when he talks about that Premier League dream, he hasn't given up on it. He's not just saying it. So you find yourself really wishing him well.
I mean, he came in a difficult situation last season when Colchester were properly in a relegation battle and managed to keep them up. But they've lost quite a lot of key players, which I know is something he alludes to again in the piece. I mean, it almost to me feels quite unfair to expect kind of Danny to come in and deliver, much more than deliver safety this time around. And it's a club where the owner Robbie Cowley is, the Cowley appointment bucked the trend a little bit, where he's generally looked to promote from within, and it's been the same faces consistently. What did he make? You saw them play Brentford, didn't you, in the cup? So hard to really get a handle on where they are up against Premier League opposition. But what did he make of them? Yeah, I mean they were the better side for long periods, which is slightly bizarre against a changed Brentford team, but still one with Kevin Schade and Witzer and players like that. It was still a very strong team. He's clearly added a lot of experience, which needed. I think the average age was about 24 point something last season, 24.2 maybe, which is like the third youngest in the division. And I think his theory is that the season they had last year is quite hard on young players, so they were going to have to bring in some experience, and he's pretty much done that. They've used the loan system again as well. They've got Aaron Donnelly from Forest, who I've seen a few times in EFL trophy games and academy games. But as you say, it's hard because they finished 90th last year, and maybe other than Morecambe, I don't think there's going to be a club that gets cut adrift too much, certainly not in the first half of the season. So put it this way, I think there'll be managers of 10 or 11 clubs in League 2, it's the bottom half of League 2, that say we should finish above Colchester. So it's difficult to do that, and it's difficult to inspire something when Danny is all about kind of relentless positivity. So it's quite difficult to do that if your aim is 90th in the Football League pyramid. So he won't be saying that. He'll be saying, we have to go higher and higher, and he'll say, look, we just need to get better every day, and over the season it'll improve. And I'm sure he's right, but it's going to be hard work as well. I guess hopefully for Danny, unlike the Pompey job where there was expectation, Huddersfield as well, at least with Colchester it feels like he's starting at such a low base, and because he's so positive, and because I think he's very good, he should be given, you mentioned there it's a project, hopefully he's given the time to build something, because as we say, especially having lost players such as Jaden Fevrier, who's made a great start at Stockport, Mingy as well, and a couple of others, it's not the easiest job to come into. On to Rob Edwards, who you spoke to before opening game of the season, and I found this I read it when he first published it, and I read it again this morning in prep for this, and it's a very emotional read. Basically, all of it. I think he's someone who very much wears their heart on their sleeve, and you've seen whether it was the promotion from Forest Green, quite a public falling out with Forest Green when he moved on to Watford, the sacking at Watford, and then the incredible journey at Luton. I mean, how was it? He's not someone I've met before. How was it spending a bit of time in his company? Yeah,
he's an absolute gent, and he is an emotional guy. He's sort of takes the mick out for himself for that, and tells me that his family take the mick out of him for that. But that doesn't come laced with apology. That's just as I say, that's just how he is, and he has been through an awful lot through the last 3 years. He's not really had a settled period, and I wonder if in the weeks after we spoke, Luton have had a pretty difficult start to the season, more than we most expected. Maybe in hindsight, and this is easy to say now, maybe in hindsight we should have expected that, because I think this is the first time Rob is in a very unique position in that he's finally expected to gain promotion from a league which he's not really had before. Luton are expected to win promotion, which they've not had since the days of them coming up from League 2 and League 1. And it almost feels like nobody really knows how to deal with that pressure. It's a very different pressure. He spoke about that in the interview. He said, look, this season is going to be different. It's going to be a very difficult pressure to deal with, and it's my job to get across to the players that will be harder and that will be different to deal with. And I think at the moment he's probably, I think it's fair to say he's struggling to do that. I know they've had some injuries, particularly in defence, which kind of kiboshed them against Burnley on the opening weekend or the opening Monday night. And maybe it just clicked pretty quickly, and by the end of October we were wondering what we were worried about. But yeah, from what he said about dealing with that, the start to this season, it hasn't completely surprised me that they've started to struggle. I really hope that A, he gets it right, and B, that Luton stick with him, because I think he has been not just a manager, he's ended up being a kind of ambassador for Luton Town over the last 2 years, which has been a pretty difficult job given the kind of roller coaster emotionally that they've been on as a club.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the Tom Lockyer situation, which makes up quite a big part of the piece. And I think, for anyone who's followed the last couple of years of Luton Town will know all about this, where, I mean, watching the playoff final against Coventry and watching Tom Lockyer go down as he did, and then the very emotional scenes afterwards when Luton were promoted to Premier League after a penalty shootout. And then again, I think I was watching Soccer Saturday when he collapsed again against Bournemouth and was said to be dead for a couple of minutes before being revived. I mean, that the emotional toll that must take, not only on Rob Edwards, but a whole football club must be, it kind of feels like it's now woven into their identity, at least in the current situation.
Yeah, and I think it was whatever happened to Luton come the end of the season, wherever position they finished in, and whatever happened this season for Rob, I think that was a masterclass of instinctive management. There was no inauthenticity to it. Rob said it as he saw it, and in doing so, I think managed to A, gain a huge amount of respect from the wider game, and B, re-establish himself in the mind of Luton supporters, at least as the leader of the club. Managers in those sorts of situations are unwittingly thrown into that role because you are the public face. Tom Lockyer was the protagonist of that particular story, horrible story, but he was not in a position where he was going to be the one to talk to media, to to radio, to TV, to your own players. It had to come from Rob, and he said he needed 48 hours to emotionally get over that, to kind of process it in his head, and then went to see, having seen Tom in hospital and seen him, yes, with all the tubes and the wires, but ostensibly smiling and happy. That was a huge relief. But Rob kind of says, but it also it makes you relive what had just happened. It's an end to the story in a sense, but it's also not an end for Rob, because he then has to go and speak to Gary Sweet, the CEO, who says, we need you now, Rob. We need you to talk to the media, and we also need you to talk to the players. And one thing that he said, which kind of really stuck with me, was that it would have been very easy to go into that team meeting and give it the whole, we do this for Tom Lockyer, we do this because of this has happened. And Rob said that felt quite selfish, to use someone else's suffering as an inspiration. So he said he didn't want to do that. He wanted to say, rather than using Tom as inspiration, let's just look at the aspects of Tom's personality that's brought him to a Premier League captain, scoring in the Premier League, having come all the way up with Luton, and let's just stick true to those principles. And as someone whose favourite team was in a relegation battle with Luton, it's almost with my regret that I ended up wanting them to lose on the last 12 games of that season. But I did, because I had to. Because you could, football isn't all fairy tales. So Luton surviving on the final day would have been the fairy tale, of course it would. But it doesn't work like that, and Rob doesn't expect it to work like that, and Tom Lockyer doesn't expect it to work like that. But the fact that he was, crying on the pitch at West Ham with supporters singing his name when they'd effectively been relegated is proof not just that they played pretty well last season and entertained, but also that Luton fans probably felt in the back of their minds that they might only ever have one Premier League season, and if they couldn't make the best of it by staying up, what they wanted to do was end the season proud of everybody involved, and that's what Rob ensured more than anything else.
It's amazing the circumstances where he took over. I mean, this was a Luton fan base who had just been kind of jilted by Nathan Jones for a second time as he left for Southampton, and a Rob Edwards who had been, I think, promised the world by Watford, thinking that the Watford hierarchy said things were going to be different with Rob Edwards, and they would back him to, was it through hell and high water, and sacked him after 11 games, and he can walk down the road to their local rivals and take to the Premier League. I mean, it was an amazing thing for kind of both parties to do, especially with Nathan Jones then being sacked not long after by Southampton and being jobless. I mean, as you kind of mentioned there, it feels like there aren't many teams that get relegated out of the Premier League with merit, and I think Luton certainly did that because they were expected to be the worst of the three, and they were anything but. As it kind of feels like right now, basically since you spoke to Rob Edwards, this is the first moment of kind of real struggle in his managerial career where things are going kind of much worse than we anticipate. Having spent a bit of time in his company, and I guess having seen his interview, for example, after the QPR game where he looked pretty distraught, how do you think that emotional side of him will be dealing with the stress of the situation?
I think that's the crux of the issue, certainly, is that emotion being poured out of you when everybody is on your side is very endearing. When it comes and I'm not saying anybody at Luton within the support or the club have lost faith yet, but when people aren't happy with how it's going, and nor will Rob be, but when some of those supporters aren't as happy, and then you see that emotion, what was once endearing sometimes becomes a little bit concerning. You think, well, has there been a cumulative... I think what people fail to understand, not just with football managers, but it's prescient in this case, is that pressure and things that happen aren't experienced in isolation. There has to be some sort of cumulative effect to these things. So if you go through a promotion and then a new job and then a sacking and then arrivals and a promotion and a relegation and the Tom Lockyer and all that, there has to be some sort of cumulative impact on that, because you get very few breaks. Even over the summer you're forced to work double hard because your team just got relegated, so there's no excuses. And the question, I think, is that Rob, I'm sure, will be asking himself, is that how much of a cumulative impact has all this had? Because it must erode everybody's kind of energy a little bit. And when you're one of the tools, and I think the other thing I should say here is that Rob is not just this is not the only tool of his management. He is, tactically he's pretty switched on. He made Luton very effective in the Premier League. He made them even more effective in the Championship to get promotion, even after everybody had cottoned on to what they were doing. So he's no slouch in that department. But what the persona of Rob Edwards is this emotional guy who kind of channels that emotion in a really positive way. If the team is losing, it's fascinating to see how that ends up happening. And I don't know how it ends up happening, and I don't know if Rob does, but they will be this international break as we speak is absolutely crucial for Luton, isn't it? Because they have to effectively be able to say, right, forget those 4 games. The season kind of starts now. We're now in the position where we have been before, where people are doubting us and saying we can't do it. So let's switch back to that mode, that we've succeeded with that, and let's do that again and push up the league. I'm sure they will. I hope they do, because as I said when we're talking about Danny Cowley, you find yourself backing certain people either because they're inspirational or because you just get the sense that they're really good people, and Rob is a really good person.
Did you? It wasn't in the piece, but did you ask him about his him going viral as a bit of a sex symbol during the course of last season?
Yeah, we spoke briefly about that. He basically just sort of laughed for sort of roughly 20 seconds.
You should have videoed it. You'd have gone viral yourself if you got that on camera.
I would have done. I think it's fair to say that he has received less congratulations for that in his own household than he has on social media. I think would be fair to say.
Fair enough. Yeah, it makes sense. I'm sure. I mean, we've been saying it for years. Amazing hair and everything else, to be fair too. And they signed Victor Moses today, taking the Barclaysman trend on Twitter a little bit too literally, but knowing how good their recruitment is, it would be no surprise if he's a decent signing for them. Danny Rohl next up. And there's kind of a thread between the Danny Cowley interview, the Rob Edwards interview, and the Danny Rohl interview that I wanted to kind of start this part with, where, and it's something that actually weirdly, by chance, Ali and I spoke about on our Substack podcast, Dear Ali and George, last week, where it does feel like, whether it's us as podcasters or journalists or just football fans, the human aspect of football seems to often be completely forgotten, where if you take, whether it's a manager or a player who have a 10, 15-year career, and you think of all the different things that will happen in their life in that time, it is absolutely inevitable that will impact their performance. And it's something that people just don't seem to really talk about. Or why would we? We have no insight into that. And, Danny Cowley said, there are times when you feel like an average football manager and a terrible parent. Rob Edwards said, something that really strikes me in the Sir Alex Ferguson and Bobby Robson films is when their children say, Dad wasn't there. And for Danny Rohl, he is someone with a young family who are still in Germany, and he's has had to move over to Sheffield in order to do his job. It feels like these are pretty seismic parts of basically the makeup of these men who are having to try and balance home life and professional life. Yeah,
and they also simultaneously have to talk to people like me about how you have to manage players in that way, and you have to look at everything in a player's life, and you have to know if their baby's ill, so maybe they need a little bit more time because they need a bit more sleep, or whether whether their partner has got a problem at work and therefore needs a bit more support, and all these million and one things that I think probably in terms of the mainstream started with Jurgen Klopp, but has been going back to Liverpool boot room and Brian Clough times in terms of micro man management and knowing how to treat people differently. And managers are doing this while also it being pretty obvious that they're in non-ideal situations themselves. As you say, Danny, I understand why his family haven't moved over after signing another contract to Sheffield Wednesday, because his kids are at school in Germany and therefore and they're quite new at school, as I understand. So they don't want to move everything over.
He's only 35.
Yeah, exactly. So he must be young, right? And that is emphatically not ideal. I think what actually happens in 99% of these cases is that they throw themselves into the football club and the culture of the city and the club that they've entered, and that makes complete sense. Because what else are you going to do, right? You're living by yourself in a city centre, Sheffield, and you're managing one of the city's two football clubs, and you want to finish above the other one if you can. And also because it enables quick wins, it enables people to see it. We're in this country, I think, is very similar to Germany in that we are absolute gits for a manager getting us or a player getting us. We obsess about it, and even if you look at it completely logically, you still obsess about it because it makes complete sense. If you can believe that the bloke in charge of your team cares half as much as you do, it kind of creates this cycle of positivity that I think Sheffield Wednesday were probably in the EFL the most emphatic benefactors of in the second half of last season.
Yeah, I mean, it was incredible what Danny Rohl did. Came into a side who hadn't won 11 games under Xisco Munoz. He was allegedly, reportedly, I mean, you might be able to shed light on this, interviewed for that job, and Chansiri decided to appoint Xisco Munoz over Danny Rohl, and then when that didn't go well, he picked up the phone and called Danny and said, actually, I made a terrible mistake, can you come back and sort this out? And yeah, I mean, the football they've played, it's been incredible to see. Similar, I'm not saying for a second, Daniel, that you're cursed, but things since you spoke to him again haven't gone.
I've thought it. Don't worry about that.
but before we talk about what's happened since, I do want to talk about that, because it's an interesting time to think about Danny Rohl, because I basically don't remember. I mean, it feels like him and Martí Cifuentes came into Sheffield Wednesday and QPR at a similar time, and both of them had probably the sharpest ascents I've ever seen of a football manager's stock, because what they did was so incredible, taking teams side by side out of the relegation zone and up, not only to safety, but comfortable safety by the end of the season. But you were there on opening day where they hosted Plymouth Argyle, and in my mind, like watching that game, I think it's very rare that you see not only such a one-sided league game where like the level of dominance from Wednesday over Argyle was just absurd. It felt like a cup game. It felt like a Premier League team playing against a League Two team. But it didn't, because the atmosphere was just felt, even through the TV, like it was absolutely rocking. You couldn't really have chosen a better game to get to Hillsborough for.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much been proven true in the weeks following. I mean, it was complete dominance. And I kind of make no apologies for getting carried away about Danny Rohl's football and off the back of that today as well, because it did feel absolutely joyous. Football supporters, as we well know, the first day of the season, you capture a moment, and what happens on that day can sort of define the next weeks or months. It felt like that's what was happening on that opening day. I think probably we all overestimated slightly Sheffield Wednesday dominance versus how bad Plymouth were, and they were wretched, and I knew they were wretched, but I didn't know it was all them. And I think also Danny is probably suffering from the sort of mistakes that people like me make, which is that you see the climb and you assume that's going to carry on forever, and at some point there has to come a setback, because it is sort of all or nothing football. I think we saw that last season, didn't we, with a kind of 4-0 defeat at Huddersfield, and then some of the big wins. It is sort of, when it clicks, it really clicks, and when it's bad, it's terrible. And maybe this isn't the worst thing for them to happen, just to get a bit of a reality check, because the squad it's got good players in it, but the squad isn't good enough to be, upper echelons of the Championship. You look at the strength of some of those clubs above them, just the sheer strength and depth, I think, of some of those clubs above them. I think the team really knows what it's doing, but I there are a couple of elements to it which I wasn't, even in the 4-0 win, I wasn't quite convinced that the whole kind of Jamal Lowe thing was slightly working, and so much goes through Bannon, which is great, which is a joy to watch when Sheffield Wednesday are doing well. But at some point, teams are going to just try and neutralise him, and then someone else is going to have to, do that work, which is been proven hard.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing having Barry Bannon at home to Plymouth Argyle. It's another thing taking Barry Bannon to playing against Leeds, or taking him to the Stadium of Light, where things have obviously not gone so well for them. I mean, the cult of personality around Danny Rohl has been incredible, and you can see why. Like, it is very Klopp-light with he's a very, very passionate on the touchline. He speaks incredibly well. In your piece, there are countless quotes about him talking about how important the fan base are and how important people are to the way that he manages. Often when things start to turn a little bit, you wonder, like, could is the manager going to keep it? We just spoke about it with Rob Edwards. Are Luton going to retain the faith in him? With Rohl, it kind of feels the other way around, where, like, even if things go badly, is it more likely that Rohl looks at Wednesday and thinks, actually, this might not be the place for me, given that he'd probably have his pick of jobs. There's Germany, where his family are just around the corner. Like, is that from clearly from talking to him, you would have had an understanding of how much he's brought into the club, but where do you see the future for him?
Yeah, I agree with you. There's no sense that he is tired of Wednesday at all. I mean, obviously he signed a new deal in May, which I was slightly surprised by, I have to say. I know he'd done very well, but generally managerial careers are not decided by how much success you have, but learning to know when to take the next journey and where that next step is to, because using the example of Rob Edwards, he got quite lucky in that the Watford thing happened but ended so quickly he could sort of forget about it. If you get stuck at certain clubs, the greatest example I can think of over the last X number of years is Chris Wilder at Sheffield United, but there are so many others, you know, going back to like Owen Coyle getting linked with Arsenal back in the day. It's always been, managers have always had these kind of purple patches, and then knowing when to make the most of those and to join an environment where enables you to get the best out of yourself again and to grow again and to be better, even better than you are. I don't think there's any sense yet that that's not happening at Sheffield Wednesday, but I agree that kind of whatever happens here, he will move on to, you know, effectively in inverted commas, a promotion, whether that's in Germany, as I suspect it would be, or here. But he is kind of all in on Sheffield Wednesday emotionally. I think he loves the city. I think being here by himself means he's sort of you know, if you replace your family with nothing, then the club effectively becomes your quasi-family for the duration of your stay here, and I think that's literally what's happened. He's sort of thrown himself into that. The players love him. You talk about Bannon, you know, you listen to players like Bannon and Josh Windass talk about the impact of his management, and they talk about him in terms of revelation. And Barry Bannon's seen quite a lot of football and seen quite a few football managers, but he sees a guy younger than him as like, yeah, this guy's the best thing I've seen. So I'm sure there has been a reality check over the last few weeks, but Sheffield Wednesday is still very lucky to have him, and I think Danny Rohl still feels very lucky to have Sheffield Wednesday, which is a good position to be in. But yeah, he's clearly going places at some point. I just hope that he does that before he has to. If things got worse, and he just sort of went out of a side door rather than head held high, fans saluting him as he went. He sort of deserves one of those send-offs, I think. You talked about Klopp light, and Klopp's always had those send-offs. And Rohl feels like a manager who would thrive in one of those situations of leaving a club but always being remembered fondly there.
Yeah, and you know, he feels like such a modern day manager where, you know, you talk about him using psychologists and even selecting coaches with different personality types in order to give the players a different, you know, sounding boards for advice. And I love the quote. You know, he says there's a slogan from basketball coach John Wooden that I stick to: a good coach can change a game, a great coach can change a life. I'm all about that. I mean, almost in like one quote there, he's almost summed up the shift in what being a manager's kind of become in football. Yeah,
he says things like that, and you know, I promise I'm very professional, but I also absolutely adore football and always have all my life. And a coach says something to you like that, and it makes you go a bit like, makes you sort of, your tummy gives you butterflies slightly, and you sort of think, I want to play under you. This isn't fair. Like, when do I get a go? Can I just have a Danny Rohl at the end of my office to sort of motivate me every morning? And we should also say, I mean, he's doing this stuff in a second language, for God's sake. And this is his first senior managerial role. It's nonsense to be this assured, and to, you know, if I would be him, I would be like, right, no media interviews, I'm not going to do that, I just want to concentrate. You know, what you tend to get is, and Rohl is unashamedly one, I'm sure, but you get these sort of wrong word to use, but let's call them like the nerdy managers who are sort of just obsessive, football obsessives, the mini peps who sort of dive into it. And I think that's almost now, for successful managers, a necessity. You sort of don't get, there's so much competition, you don't really get away with it anymore. Now that championship clubs can go to Germany and Spain and France and get managers, and they do very well, I think that's a given now. And it's the ones who manage to deal with that, but also be incredibly personable and motivational and inspirational. And he is one of those guys. As I say, you just find yourself going, yes, Danny, keep talking, Danny, please. You are like, keep going. Like, you're giving me lines without even knowing it. You're you know. And so, yeah, he's a very switched on guy. It's the first time I'd met him. It's incredibly scary that he was younger than me, because he talks with this sort of maturity that makes you think he's been around the game for a long time, which, you know, clearly he has in terms of coaching setups. But it's a hell of a difference stepping out at Hillsborough with 30-odd thousand fans in your first job and nobody really knowing who you are, and getting them to fall in love with you within the space of about 3 months.
Yeah, so often we hear fans of clubs and people say when an inexperienced manager's floated up saying, oh, will the players respect him, and will the fans buy into it? And I think Danny Rohl's a case in point, showing that if you're a good enough coach, if you're a good enough speaker, if you do whatever you can to try and get the club, then in experience it shouldn't be any kind of issue in terms of getting results. Finally, someone who, unlike Danny Rohl, unlike Danny Cowley, probably unlike Rob Edwards unless you're a Wolves fan, someone that we all have known about for a long time in Tom Cleverley, who has managed by far the fewest games of any of the managers we're talking about. He's just taken charge of his first season at Watford, and I mean, this is really interesting, and he kind of mentions it in the piece, but he's been at Watford for 7 years under 12 different managers in various guises. You're kind of sitting there being like, why would anyone who's been at Watford for 7 years take on this job? But he puts a positive spin on it, doesn't he?
He does. And he makes a good point, which is that the one thing that Watford, I'm almost certainly forgetting a Watford manager here, as is perfectly acceptable to do. But the one thing they haven't really tried... It's a
mastermind topic, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's the one thing they haven't really tried is that sort of someone who really knows the club from within. Partly because by the sheer nature of the managerial turnover, people haven't, managers have arrived, wanted new players, coaching staff have changed. They haven't really had another option. I know they appointed Billy McKinley, maybe he was slightly internal appointment, maybe back in the day.
Frantically Google as you speak.
Yeah, I think, and he only had like 4 games, and end up being effectively a caretaker manager. I think he was already on the staff.
8 days in charge.
Yeah, so
he was Oscar Garcia's assistant.
Yeah, so I think that's the only time they've done that, and it lasted for whatever reason. It lasted for 8 days. Cleverley is a bit different in that he has already taken on a role of senior player, and as he says, one of the benefits of being a senior player at Watford through all that change is that you end up inevitably taking on quite a lot of responsibility for the younger players yourself, because you're a face they know and you're a senior role and you have played for Manchester United in England. So I think that probably it was the period that walked him down the path of doing coaching badges, because he was looking after young players at the time almost via osmosis through the very environment of Watford. And then when his playing career ended, and you get the sense, we might talk about this, but you get the sense from Tom that it's a bizarre thing to say, but he was sort of quite glad that his playing career had ended. It wasn't by no means the sunlit uplands of international football and the top of the Premier League as you might imagine, given his Wikibox career. So he went straight, and he threw himself straight into the under-18 work. And what happens at Watford, I guess, is that if you show willing, people know you, people like you, and you are coaching in some capacity, a job above you will pretty soon come up because someone will leave the job, or a manager will leave and everyone will move up one, or a raft of coaches will leave. And if you put your hand up and show willing, and he is very popular with sporting director, with owners, because he's been around the place for a while, and it has come along. I've no idea how he ends up, but my goodness me, he started pretty well.
Started really well. Really impressed, and it was there's kind of a bit of a juxtaposition in your piece, nothing to do with what you're saying, but in terms of Cleverley himself. He talks about how the fortune of the beginner, and how he feels like, unlike being a player, this is a new start for him. But then he also is seemingly pretty scarred from his playing career, where he mentions twice how important it is to stay off social media, which I guess is probably him having had some pretty miserable times scrolling through social media. You mentioned the petition that was signed by 30,000 people to get him dropped by England. He may not realise this, but it feels like quite a lot of his emotional intelligence has been formed by his negative experiences as a player and formed by those scars.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and it was quite difficult to hear. He after the game, we went to interview after the game, which was the EFL Cup game against Plymouth that they'd won, and we were chatting, and because they play Plymouth, and he knows Wayne Rooney clearly from Manchester United days, Rooney sort of came past and they had a chat and said, "Oh yes, we'll go and have a, we'll go and speak to each other afterwards and catch up." And they felt like two completely different entities to me, even though they've got, Rooney's got a lot more managerial experience, but Cleverley felt like the manager. And I still look at Wayne Rooney and see the superstar England footballer, and Cleverley just doesn't feel on that level. And I think that's probably how he saw himself for most of his career. The criticism clearly didn't help, and it wasn't just at England level, it was Manchester United as well. But he says growing up in super club environment, he never really felt like he fitted in. He played an awful lot of football, but the experiences he had after Ferguson's time at Manchester United, the Moyes era, the finishing seventh, the England stuff, the then getting sold to Everton and it not going particularly well there for Everton or him. I think he sort of felt like, and I don't mean to put words in his mouth here, but sort of felt like a kind of why me, like wherever I go are things not quite working. And so he got to Watford and I think enjoyed playing in the Championship, being a senior player, not having everything being about how is Tom Cleverley playing this week. And I've no doubt that his managerial career is in part fueled by this. I want to write a different story of Tom Cleverley in football, because it would be very easy for him not to have got that chance. If he hadn't done his coaching badges at that time, you can kind of get stuck in I'll do something else, or I'll just do, some scouting stuff, or I'll do some TV work, and you just get out of it and it never quite comes up. The fact that he almost started the next day in Watford's academy when he'd stopped playing, and there was probably even some crossover, means he's really hit the ground running. And he's a humble guy. He sort of says, it's luck of the beginner, I'm sure, that's why I don't feel any pressure at the moment, blah blah blah. But actually he started the season, I hate to bring this up, but I only do so because I completely agreed with you and Ali when you said Watford were going to be in trouble this season. I absolutely agree.
24th out of 24.
Yeah, I mean, that felt like Tom was stepping into a sort of circle of fire in which more experienced, more successful, more obvious fitting managers than him had not been able to, had basically floundered. And yet he seems to have managed to not just shut that noise out for himself, and not just do it for the players, but also have a really good relationship with everybody at the club, which is, we know at Watford, is pretty important.
Yeah, for sure. And on that, I mean, I would say, firstly, it's still early days, and I hope that, as we often see very commonly, and I think it's especially pertinent with a rookie manager, I really hope the Watford start of the season doesn't mean that expectation levels are suddenly raised, that they should be challenging for the playoffs. Then suddenly, if they're 15th in October, November, people are saying, well, Cleverley obviously hasn't got it, because it should be remembered that he has lost a lot of key players. And a lot of, if you look at the value of those players itself and the players that have come in, there's a fair amount that's gone out there. But I also think it was just interesting how he said, but more that is the relationship those in the building, such as Scott Duxbury, Watford's chairman, Gianluca Nani, the sporting director, and then I know how the club works, how to expect the operations in the transfer market to work, and our goal to develop young players and the demand. Now, there is a massive subtext in that last quote, which is, I think, him basically saying, when things are taken out of my hands with transfers and I'm not particularly happy, I won't react like other people do, and I understand that my job is to coach whatever I'm given.
Yeah, and let's face it, this is no shade thrown at Tom Cleverley at all, but he was a fairly cheap appointment at a time when Watford needed a fire putting out, and they were not a particularly attractive club to external managers. I think that's sometimes the case between seasons at Watford. It's certainly the case mid-season, but it does seem to have, kind of by hook or by crook or by just rolling the dice enough times, it does seem to make some sense that they have a guy who gets it, isn't trying to change Watford, because so many people I think have said, look, Watford are going to have to change, Watford are going to have to change, and I don't think they will. I think they will always just, it's gone too far now under this ownership, it's always going to be like that. So what's your best other option is to get someone in who's lived through that for 7 years and quite enjoyed himself there more than any other place in his career. I think that's the kind of crucial aspect of this is I think there are very few people in football who have had a relationship with Watford over the last 15 years who would say the best part of my last 15 years was when I was at Vicarage Road. That is true for Cleverley. He enjoyed himself there more than at Manchester United and England and Everton. So why not try and build on that kind of goodwill? The squad is still a little bit weird, I think, but then you know maybe it's always going to be weird, and that's just how.
Moussa Sissoko and Angelo Ogbonna,
exactly, yeah,
in the spine.
Yeah, and it's a team where you watch them and a player comes off the bench, and I think it must have been Tom Ince, and you're like, oh, okay, fine, like. Yeah, things like that happen at Watford where they become that sort of Bermuda Triangle where you end up finding players. But he does seem to, just purely through this sort of serenity and composure, as if to say, no dramas. The last thing I want is drama. So I'm going to be as cool and as calm and as just chill as possible. And things will happen at this football club that may seem like drama, but I'm going to stay out of them. And I'm just going to try and concentrate on results. And yeah, you're absolutely right. They are, 6 games into a season. They've won 5 of them. We're slightly unfortunate to lose to Sheffield United purely by just starting the game really badly. Obviously conceding and then conceding a penalty which was saved. But they've been the better team in their other games. So they absolutely outplayed Plymouth, which is obviously kind of the theme of my early season. But... yeah, they look pretty streetwise. They don't look like a team managed by a rookie, which is, the thing that kind of knits together him and Danny Rohl is you could watch those teams play at their best, and it looks like they've been managed by these guys for 2 or 3 years. Everybody seems to know what they're doing, which is pretty impressive given they've only had 1 pre-season.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm aware that I'm keeping you for very long here, so just before we do let you go, because I do think everyone should absolutely hopefully be given a taste of it here, make sure they do check out all of Daniel's pieces as he throughout the whole season tours the 92, does the 92, speaking to some of the protagonists in it. And it's not just managers. Just want to finish off with a quick word on a piece that went out last week where you spoke to Rhian Brewster, who we'll touch on it very briefly because people should go and read it. But I mean, he's someone who I remember at particularly at Swansea in his loan spell, just being this absolute live wire, just such a fun player to watch, like unbelievably energetic off the ball, a brilliant finisher, scored 10 league goals I think that season. And it's been sad to watch the injury issues that he's had and the bad luck that he's had. I remember he missed a penalty for Sheffield United in the Premier League. I think it's always in the Championship promotion season where you just wondered like when are things going to turn his way. The fact that he's now 24 as well shows, it feels like he's the perennially young footballer because we just haven't really seen him much. Back fit again now. How's he doing?
He's incredibly philosophical given what's happened to him over the last 3 years. I was definitely guilty of because you can't be over every single footballer. Well, you and Ali can be, but I can't be over every single footballer. You sort of, you have a sort of, I would describe it as sort of a 40% coverage of most players. So you sort of know certain things that have happened. So, and they become like mental bullet points. And so for Brewster, it was kind of overpriced at the move, was a gamble, barely scored for Sheffield United, and I think some injury problems. Actually, the injury problems are the headline and the footnote to this. It's been a horrific 3 or 4 years. I mean, even going back to the age of 18, and he effectively like did his ankle and did his knee unbeknownst to him in the same incident when playing for Liverpool's under 23s. He then gets this horrible hamstring injury which requires surgery, and then just as he gets fit and starts to look good again, he basically does exactly the same thing to his hamstring and requires surgery again, and has missed near enough 3 years of football by the age of 24. And this is a kid who, in that England under 17 is playing with sort of 6 or 7 players who have since gone on to play for the England senior team. You're looking at, like Gahey and Foden and, Gibbs White and Smith Rowe. It's all of those. And he was the leader of that team. He was his top scorer. He scored a hat-trick against Brazil in the semi-finals. And I know that, people develop at different rates and sometimes... But it wasn't that. He wasn't this kind of physical specimen that was just bullying people, and that's why things have gone slightly differently. He was, as you say, this live wire forward who said repeatedly in our interview, like, I just want to play football. Like, that's all I've ever wanted. It's not about kind of money and status, and yes, I moved for a big fee, but that's because somebody wanted to pay for it, and Jurgen Klopp was gutted to see him go. But he just wants to play football. And there's a quote at the end of the interview which I'll slightly paraphrase because I've not got it in front of me, but he just sort of says, look, the best feeling in the world is when I'm running in a competitive match and I'm not thinking about injuries. All I'm doing is running. And that's all I've ever wanted, and that's all I will ever want. And my God, like, I just got a kind of lump in my throat because I just watched him play football for 7 or 8 minutes to kind of grind out the game against Watford off the bench. He then had to go through this extended warm down period because he only played 10 minutes, and he's just running up and down the field. And you can sort of see that it's heartbreaking for him a little bit because he doesn't want to be just running up and down the field after playing for 10 minutes. He wants to be on the pitch and play football. And we said it about managers, but even the best of us at doing it are not good enough at understanding what these people go through when things go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully anyone listening to this may have pause for thought next time on a terrace when they start shouting abuse at a manager or a player and wonder what's actually going on at home. Not that any of our listeners would ever do that, obviously. But great to chat with you, Daniel, about just 5 of the many, many interesting people who are involved in the EFL week to week. As I say, I'd recommend anyone to go and check out Daniel's pieces and the podcast. Where can they find them? Daniel?
Yeah, so podcast is called Doing the 92, which is, as I say, we're just going to run through 2 specific case studies a week. That's on all platforms. And yeah, if you go to inews.co.uk, or I think it's inews.co.uk/doing the 92 means you can get to the homepage where all the pieces are stored, or they're on my Twitter feed as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Daniel. We'll speak again soon. Thank you guys for listening. We'll be back with our usual betting show on Thursday and next Monday's review after the international break of all the EFL action.